Great. So, oh, it does say I need the host to disable the screen sharing.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's my bad. See how to do this. That's one of the things I should have asked you beforehand. That should enable you.
Yes, great. Do you all see a PowerPoint slide right now?
Looks great.
Great. All right. So I'm really excited to be here. As it was introduced, right, my name is Robin Dodson, and I am with Silent Spring Institute, and I'm an exposure scientist. So I study how we're exposed to chemicals in our everyday lives, and the impacts that those might have on our health. So I was really excited to be able to be with you tonight to share some of our research from Silent Spring Institute. For those of you who aren't as familiar with Silent Spring, we are a nonprofit research organization that looks at the links between the environment and women's health. We were founded in 1994 by the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, who had observed elevated breast cancer rates on Cape Cod. And traditional risk factors, lifestyle factors like how many children you had, your access to mammograms, things like that, could not actually explain the elevated rates on Cape Cod. And so they actually, over on the right there, you see them marching to the State House to get funding to secure research to look at the environmental causes of breast cancer. The thought there was just something about the Cape, something about living on Cape Cod. And so they were successful in actually getting some research funding from the state to actually create what was termed at the time a lab of our own, and they named it Silent Spring Institute in honor of Rachel Carson, of course, one of the founding environmentalists in the US, as well as many people may not realize this, but as she was testifying in Congress about the effects of DDT and pesticides, she actually was dealing with breast cancer. And so that is why we're named in that way. So we've been at it for over 25 years, and our goal is to try to prevent cancers by reducing exposures to harmful chemicals in our everyday lives. So about 2/3 of Americans think that cancer is mostly due to inherited genes. And I want to kind of share some evidence that perhaps may help you kind of rethink about what you might think might be the role of genes in cancer development. Here, what I'm showing is incidence rates of cancers by age bracket amongst men and women in the United States. And you can see that over time, more broadly, cancer rates are going up. And incidence rates like these cannot be driven solely by genetics, right? We don't evolve that fast. Genes cannot explain these changes over decades. So there must be something else going on. And in fact, if you look more closely at the breast cancer risk factors, most breast cancer cases are not due to inherited genes. In fact, less than 30% or so of breast cancer cases are due to genetic factors alone. And those high-risk genes that you might hear about, the BRCA1, BRCA2 genes, in fact, only contribute about less than 10% of breast cancer cases. So that leaves the rest of that pie there, the blue there, about 70%, is something else. It's not just genes. Sure, it can be the interaction between some lifestyle factors or environmental factors and genes, but surely it's also just lifestyle factors alone or environmental exposures as well. So by lifestyle factors, what I mean there is things like alcohol intake, tobacco use, things like that. And so there's a lot to learn there in the rest of the pie. And perhaps a lot that it could be modifiable potentially as we look to try to seek to prevent breast cancer development. In fact, breast cancer is a kind of a disease that can be influenced at multiple stages in our lives. In fact, risk factors that occur kind of before even birth, while in the womb, during puberty, during first pregnancy, and of course during menopausal transition. All these times are critical kind of stages within our lives that could increase our risks or increase our susceptibility, I should say, to developing breast cancer. So studying cancer is pretty difficult if you're thinking about trying to identify risk factors for cancer. And what I mean by that is that many cancers, breast cancer included, are long latency diseases. They take years to develop. For breast cancer, we typically think it's a latency disease of about 20 to 30 years, right? So think back 20, 30 years ago, something that happened then is what could actually increase your risk to developing breast cancer. That's really hard to study, right? Especially if we're used to thinking about kind of accumulating evidence in kind of the health world in the more traditional ways of thinking about things like clinical trials or epidemiological studies. And what I mean by that is that, you know, in clinical trials or epidemiological studies, what we do is we try to classify people according to who was exposed or who was dosed and who wasn't dosed. And then we sit and we wait and we watch them over time. And we say, oh, did those that were dosed or those that were exposed, did they have higher rates of cancer than others? Well, that doesn't quite work in long latency diseases with humans, right? I'm not signing up for that clinical trial necessarily. And so instead, we need to have kind of a new framework for thinking about cancer prevention science. And so what I'm showing here is actually a kind of a paradigm that was put forth actually for the President's Cancer Panel in 2010 when they were looking at the environmental contributors to cancer. And the President's Cancer Panel looked to the research community and said, come up with a new way. It's not, you know, our traditional approaches aren't necessarily working when we're thinking about long latency diseases. And so this is actually what was put forth by our executive director, Julia Brody. And she put forth this idea of a kind of a weight of evidence approach, is that instead of thinking so linearly, instead of thinking like, I'm gonna like have a well-defined exposure and then just sit and wait and follow people over time, what if we combine what we knew, research on the biological mechanisms, so identifying chemicals or agents or some sort of risk factors that have a biological plausibility for being related to the disease, and we combine that with research on how we're exposed to those agents. Well, if we combine those, that enough should be basis for action. It's this weight of evidence instead of waiting around to kind of try to prove it in a more of a clinical trial sense. So that would be the basis of action, excuse me, the basis for action for things like education, regulations, or reformulations. And so this is actually how Silent Spring operates. We have toxicologists who work on that, the blue side there, the biological mechanism side, who are identifying chemicals that are plausibly linked to breast cancer. And then we have folks like me, exposure scientists, who study, okay, you tell me what chemicals, and I'm gonna go figure out if we're actually exposed to those chemicals in our everyday lives. So, but how do we do that? The chemical landscape is so vast. How do we try to start prioritizing chemicals from a biological perspective? There are estimates of, at least in US commerce, of maybe 60,000 to 80,000 chemicals in commerce. Some of the global estimates more recently have come out, maybe it's like 3 times that. So 300,000 chemicals in global commerce. How do you start prioritizing some of those chemicals? To start, you know, I can't measure all those chemicals at the same time. And so what we've done, at least and others have done, is start coming up with this idea of trying to identify what are some of those key characteristics of carcinogens. So I'm talking about environmental carcinogens. And can we start trying to think about them by their characteristics? So is a chemical or an agent likely to act in this way. So for example, you might ask, is a chemical genotoxic? Meaning, does it damage the DNA in some way? Well, that helps us. We can do some tests on genotoxicity on chemicals and start trying to prioritize chemicals that way. We could also look to see whether or not, way down in number 8, whether or not it somehow modulates some sort of receptor-mediated effect. What that means is, like, does it interact with our hormone system in some way that would increase then the risk to subsequent development of a hormonal cancer, like breast cancer, like prostate cancer, like uterine cancer? So this is one way that the research community has kind of come together to try to understand and start binning some of these chemicals and start trying to classify them and prioritizing them. At Silent Spring, we've looked at 3 kind of major biological pathways. There are more, but our research is focused on chemicals that can damage DNA. So things like, or agents, so things like ionizing radiation, which would have a direct effect on the DNA, kind of a classic carcinogen. We look at chemicals that act like hormone disruptors that could promote tumor growth, right? So if you take breast cancer cells and you put them in the lab and you start dosing them with estrogen, they will grow and grow. And so that will promote the tumor growth. So what about those chemicals that might act like estrogen? Those might also be tumor promoters. We know from actually from very large, well-conducted studies that things like hormone replacement therapy, HRT, has actually been shown to increase breast cancer rates or risk because of this action, because of the potential for promoting tumor growth. We also focus on chemicals that can somehow alter our susceptibility or increase our susceptibility. So these might be chemical exposures that happen earlier in life, say even in the womb, and then subsequent, you might have some sort of kind of subsequent exposure that then could increase your risk. The example here is a pharmaceutical example, but it's for DES, diethylstilbestrol, which was prescribed to prevent miscarriages, mostly in the 50s and 60s. And unfortunately, we see increased risks of breast cancer, not only amongst the women who actually took DES, but actually among their daughters who were exposed in utero. And so this is where a lot of our work has focused, just simply to help us kind of whittle things down from all the kind of the chemicals out there, the chemical landscape. So where do we go to get some of this information? Well, as I kind of alluded to before, we don't have a lot of clinical trials out there about people, willfully kind of raising their hands and volunteering to be in studies where they are exposed to different chemicals. Instead, rather, we've had to look towards the animal evidence as a way to help predict cancer in humans. And there is actually fairly good concordance between the animal testing or the animal studies and the human studies, which helps us kind of reinforce our confidence in some of those results and using them to help us then identify, prioritize chemicals and potentially regulate them for having effects, say, as breast cancer carcinogens. So I talked about chemicals that could interact with our hormone systems. Those are extremely important when we're talking about hormonal cancers like breast cancer or prostate cancer. But actually the endocrine system or the hormone system in our bodies are linked to numerous health outcomes. So exposure to these type of chemicals can actually have fairly profound effects. Exposure to endocrine disruptors, things that can act like endocrine chemicals or hormones in our bodies, have been shown to lower fertility and sperm quality and other reproductive health concerns. They've been shown to alter immune system function, neurological development, metabolic issues. So you might have heard the term obesogens, so those chemicals that can actually increase the development of fat cells or lipid cells in our bodies. And the key here is that a lot of these effects are not necessarily overt. They're not obvious immediately. right? So these things kind of develop either over time, or they're happening kind of pretty much a kind of under the radar. And this is what makes this really difficult to study in terms of health effects, studying health effects. Because you can have these things, basically, you can have a chemical that interferes somehow with the system that sets off a series of events that isn't kind of recognized until later. So imagine, one of those, the ball machine at the Museum of Science, right? Like, it is not necessarily that time that it kind of drops down that spiral kind of slide, but it could be that it does that and then it goes up a ramp and then it drops down and it bounces off something. So it's kind of if you perturb one part of that system, the whole thing can go awry, right? And so this is what makes endocrine disruptors or hormone disruptors, studying them from a health perspective, not so easy. I guess it makes it very complicated. But it is something that I think the research community has been developing better methods over the years, and people have begun to realize the importance of these chemicals that are interfering with our hormone systems. So why focus on chemicals in our everyday environment? Well, hopefully I've been trying to motivate that a little bit, but the first is that, for example, most breast cancer cases are not related to genetics, right? In fact, 80% of women diagnosed with breast cancer are the first in their family to get the disease. So we know it's not solely a genetic disease. We also know that exposure to chemicals increases risk of breast cancer and other cancers. We can see that in animal studies. We can see that from the limited kind of epidemiological studies that have been conducted. And unfortunately, we know that everyone is exposed to potentially carcinogenic chemicals because they're everywhere. And so now this is where kind of my expertise comes in. It's an exposure scientist where I get to start playing detective. I'm going to say they're everywhere. I'm going to tell you now kind of all the detective work I've done over the last 15 years or so to try to identify exactly where they are. So first, I want to kind of pause and have you think about the word pollution. When we think about pollution, I don't know. I mean, I typically think, when I say this to some crowds, people think about like smokestacks kind of out in the distance, spewing off kind of nasty things, but it's far away, right? But rather, a lot of pollution is much more personal than that, right? All these things in your everyday lives, you're bringing them home. It becomes personal. In fact, pollution levels, so concentrations of chemicals indoors compared to outdoors because of smokestacks, are often much higher. In fact, indoor concentrations of many chemicals are 2 or 5 or even 10, 100 times higher indoors than they are outdoors. So pollution is much more proximate than I think a lot of people traditionally think about pollution. So here are some examples of endocrine disrupting chemicals that I'll be talking about, and they're found in products that we use every day. So they include things like BPA, you may have heard of. It's called bisphenol A. It also has a bunch of what we call chemical cousins. So there's BPF, BPS, BPAF, BPN. So all of those that are basically bisphenols, they look similar. Bisphenol A is a fairly well-established estrogenic chemical. It acts like estrogen in the body. It's found in things like can linings. It's found in things like hard water bottles. It can be found in glasses. It can be found in some dental work. Then there are things like UV filters. What I mean by these are chemicals that are like active chemical ingredients in sunscreens, but they can also be added to products to make that product last longer, right? So that the packaging doesn't fade. It can be added to things like paints so that your wall color doesn't fade over time. And some of those have been shown to be estrogenic. And then there are chemicals that are antimicrobials or preservatives, things like triclosan, which actually has been mostly phased out, which used to be found in toothpaste and hand soaps. There are things like flame retardants. Flame retardants are chemicals that are intentionally added to furnishings and electronics to stop flame growth. Unfortunately, the use of them, at least at the levels that they were used at, were shown to be ineffective from a fire safety perspective. So we were just dumping a bunch of chemicals into furnishings without actually any added fire safety benefit. Things like phthalates. And I know I'm throwing a lot of chemical names. This one in particular, most people remember though, because it's kind of funny looking. It's PHTHALATES. And so that's kind of easy to remember. But phthalates can be found in things like plastics or personal care products. They're what makes perfume last long when you apply it in the morning and it lasts all day long. Of course, there are things like parabens. Those are preservatives found in many cosmetics and personal care products. And then PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. You may have heard about these, unfortunately, because of you're seeing them in the news more and more because they are groundwater contaminants or drinking water contaminants. But they're also found in things like waterproof or stain-resistant clothing and treatments. So I'll talk a lot more about some of these examples here, but I just wanted to kind of give an example of, or kind of a snapshot here, rather, of all those chemicals in your everyday lives. So where are these chemicals coming from? Well, I said they're in products that we use every day. Well, we actually tried, about 10 years ago, we did a study where we actually tried to, go and pick out products that people are using every day. We looked at kind of the market data, and picked kind of very common products and tried to learn what was in those products. Well, we didn't get very far. In fact, we actually even tried to call the manufacturers of many of these products and couldn't get past kind of the customer service line. And so we were left with the only thing that we could do to really understand what was in these products is that we actually tested the products. In fact, over 200 products, things like cleaners, household cleaners, soaps, lotions, cosmetics, and hair products. And we sent those products off to a lab, and we had them analyzed for over 60 chemicals that are either EDCs, so they're endocrine disrupting chemicals, or they're associated with asthma. So we've already seen some of these names on the previous slide: parabens, phthalates, BPA. And these are each check mark represents when we found it in that category. So right in cleaning products, which is that first column there, we found all but parabens in the cleaning products that we looked for. And if you look across, you can see that all of the chemical groups of interest were found in at least one of the product categories. And it wasn't just one at a time. It wasn't just one phthalate. It could be multiple phthalates, or it could be some phthalates, some antimicrobials, some alkophenols. And all of these, especially if they all act the same, these exposures can start adding up, right? I don't use just one cleaner and walk away. I also use lotions, I use shampoo every day, I use soaps, and all of that can add up in terms of an exposure. We know that these chemicals don't stay in the products. We know that they get into our bodies. In fact, this is actually data from the National Biomonitoring Program, which is run by CDC. They have this program that's called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which is a kind of a periodic survey where they're looking at health and nutrition across the United States. And they do this in kind of a complex, kind of weighted probability way to try to basically make it generalizable across the United States. And part of that is that they actually test people's urine samples and blood for environmental chemicals. And if you look at that data, you can see that this is from one cycle, which a cycle is a 2-year, for adult females, that nearly every American has these chemicals in their body. And so things like parabens, right? Those are those preservatives found in cosmetics and personal care products. Those bisphenols, again, are pretty common. Benzophenone 3 is a UV filter. It's an active ingredient in many sunscreens. It's added to plastics to make them last longer. And so most Americans, nearly all, have these chemicals in their bodies. And if we dig in a little bit further, and this is what it's taking the same data, the data for adult females, and we look at that data based on race and ethnicity, we can actually see that not everyone is exposed equally. In fact, non-Hispanic Black women have much higher levels. This is methylparaben, just one example in which actually non-Hispanic Black women have much higher levels of some of these chemicals in their bodies. And the question is why, right? Exposure scientist. So something like this makes me wonder why, and I start asking questions and start trying to figure out what are some of the important exposure sources that might be unique to non-Hispanic Black women. Excuse me. So this is actually, I want to put forward a framework for thinking about this. And this can be what's called the environmental injustice of beauty. The idea is that consumer product use patterns are a result of not individual choices, but because of a systematic kind of racism that is happening in which women and others, people of color, are disproportionately using certain products to meet certain beauty standards. So for example, things like colorism and the use of skin lightening creams among women, which is very popular among some Asian communities and African communities. And unfortunately, many of these skin lightening creams have been shown to include mercury, which you certainly have probably heard of, mercury poisoning, which is a potent neurotoxicant. But it can also be things like hair texture preferences. The idea is to have kind of straight, shiny hair, and Black women using hair relaxers and other hair care products, and increasing their exposure to things like parabens. And then of course there can be things like odor discrimination. And what I mean, I don't mean body odor here, I actually mean feminine odor discrimination, the idea of women needing to be clean. And so the use of things like douches and other feminine care products, which can increase exposure to things like phthalates. And of course, these have implications on the health disparities that we are also observing, in particular among women of color and Black women. For example, uterine fibroids are much higher among Black women than others. And so this is starting to kind of help us think of a framework for our investigations and trying to understand what are important exposure sources, and then ultimately trying to develop ways to intervene and to try to limit those exposures and help people limit exposures. So here to just flesh this out, it's actually because of the national biomonitoring data that I showed and the unequal exposures is we did actually, we extended our product testing to include hair products that are used by Black women. And here I'm showing, again, many of these same chemical groups you have seen before. And then over on the right, you can see the products that we found these chemicals in. Now, just like before, right, where I said before that EDCs, endocrine disrupting chemicals, are very common in the everyday products, they're also very common in these hair products that are used by women of color. And it's important that not only that they were found, but in fact, they were tended to be found at levels that were kind of at the upper end of some of the previous product testing work. And this is, we're starting to put together those pieces of the puzzle. Higher exposures to methylparabens, parabens found in many of these products that are uniquely used perhaps by Black women because of these environmental injustice of beauty, these beauty standards that are kind of promoting, and even in some ways, we think about not until recently, some of these hair discrimination acts, the idea is that we forced women to straighten their hair and to use some of these products. So this actually launched another study that we're actively involved in right now. We call the Taking Stock study. And this is a community-based participatory research project in California. We're working very closely with our community partner, Black Women for Wellness, who's in Los Angeles, as well as researchers at Occidental College and Columbia University. And the goal here is to try to document product use patterns across women in California, and then do a deeper dive among Black women and Latinas living in South Los Angeles, and follow that up with some product testing to try to understand a bit more about potential exposures. So this Taking Stock study, it's working very closely with our community partners. And we did a broad survey across California to look at, deploy a product use survey that over nearly 600 women actually responded to. Here we're just showing results from women 18 to 35. But on average, women reported using 8 personal care products per day. And we had one participant who actually reported using 30 products per day. The reason this is important is because, as I said before, is that those products that we were testing, they each had chemicals of concern in them. They each had these EDCs in them. Now you multiply that by 8, right? So, or it just adds up. The idea is that we are not just using one product at a time. In fact, women tend to use many products every day. And that's important when we're thinking about the cumulative exposure burden. We also found that product use varies by race ethnicity. This isn't necessarily a new finding when we think about studies that previously demonstrated differences between Black and white women in their product use, but this was one of the first to include Asian women, and there's very few data out there on Hispanic or Latinx. And so this is showing the differences in the number of products used by product category. So we asked about cosmetics, we asked about feminine care products, we asked about hair products, other personal care products like leave-on products. That's important from an exposure perspective, because if you leave it on your skin all day, you have a higher potential for exposure. Those are things like lotions. And then we have things like rinse-off products. Those are things like soaps. And these are the cumulative distribution plots. So further to the right, especially along this median line here, means higher levels. So we can see here that Asian women and Latinas tended to use more cosmetics. Hair product use was higher among Black women, followed by Hispanics. And that some feminine care products tend to be more commonly used among Black women compared to other groups. This is really important as we start to try to understand why we observe these exposure disparities and health disparities. Again, kind of adding to the research to try to identify what's contributing to those disparities so that we can then develop effective interventions. This is data from that same study, and what I'm showing here are their products that we asked about listed across the top there. So all the way to the left there is deodorant, and all the way to the right are skin lighters. And basically, if it's blue, it means that you used it, and if it's gray, it means you don't use it. And the top chunk there is looking at the top 10% of users. So we just ranked them by total number of products used. And the bottom 10% here. What's important here is that there are some women who are using a significant amount of products, and they tend to be things like cosmetics. So it's not like women don't tend to just use one cosmetic. You tend to use multiple cosmetics. Things like not only mascara, but then you also use eyeliner, and you also use concealer, and then you use makeup remover. So it kind of, again, this idea is that you're not using one product at a time, and we can't think about exposures to just chemicals in that one product. These things are adding up. We're also very interested in the use of scented products. And there's a couple of reasons here. One, because it gets at this kind of odor discrimination issues, but it also gets at unfortunately, the way the labeling regulations are in the United States is that, and you may notice this if you flip over any of your products that you use, is that they can list all the ingredients, but then they can use a term like fragrance, and they don't have to actually disclose what's in that fragrance. And we know that that fragrance mixture, say in that fragrance body lotion or something like that, that can be a couple or maybe even 100 different chemicals, all within that vague term, fragrance. And previous work had shown, previous product testing work that we had done has shown that actually that there was a correlation between the fragrance being listed on a product and the presence of phthalates. And so this is kind of a proxy to try to get at phthalate exposures. Phthalates are not typically found on a label if you flip that product over, but fragrance is typically found on a label. So this is getting at whether or not we can help inform interventions. Also, we're wondering kind of where women in particular are seeking scented products, because that's an area that we can kind of work in. So this may not surprise you at all, right? That hair products in particular are really hard to find fragrance-free hair products. It's easier to find some of the others, and so women are opting there. One thing that I do want to point out here again is actually in the middle here, these menstrual products. The use of scented products was quite low, but this in particular is really something that I think we need to pay more attention to, because this is using fragrance in products that have an extremely high exposure potential, right? Because of how they are used, and something that we are digging into a bit more because of the potential exposure implications. So I've been talking a lot about products, and I mean, a lot of my research focuses on consumer products or even personal care products. But a lot of my research also actually focuses on the indoor spaces. And that's because those chemicals, I showed that they don't stay in the products. They get into our bodies. They also get into our houses. And that is not only because of the products we're using, but also because of many other sources in the house. Building materials, furnishings. I'm just looking around my office right now, like all these things that we bring into our indoor spaces could potentially contain these chemicals that don't necessarily stay put. They can move out of them. So we have a whole lot of sources. And then of course, there's the physical structure and how we behave or what we do inside of our homes that can influence how we're exposed to it. So this is actually a conceptual model that was put forward a while ago from a colleague of mine, Gary Demkowitz at Harvard. This idea of moving environmental injustice indoors, and the idea of thinking about that exposure disparities and then subsequent health disparities are likely a result of many factors when you're thinking about the indoor spaces, not only sources, but also, is it poor housing quality? What is the ventilation like? How are people using their homes? And we've done at Silent Spring a lot of work looking at indoor exposures. So, right, these chemicals I've already shown, right, these endocrine disrupting chemicals are in products, they're in our bodies, and now I'm going to kind of share some of our research on how they're in our homes. So this work started, this is some of the first work we did about 20 years ago, almost 23 years ago now, on Cape Cod, because that's where we were focusing much of our research in the beginning, with what we call the household exposure study. In fact, we were the first to measure many of these endocrine disruptors in the United States in the homes, the first ever to try to look at indoor air and house dust for these chemicals. So we've done a lot of work. We've done work on Cape Cod. We then went out to California and recruited homes out there, again, getting indoor air measurements and house dust measurements. We've worked in low-income housing or subsidized housing in Boston. We've worked on college campuses. We've worked in subsidized housing in Boston, Cincinnati, and New Orleans. we've collected hundreds of samples over the years to look for these endocrine disrupting chemicals. And it's not easy, right? So I mentioned that we take measurements both in indoor air and house dust. You might be wondering a little bit about house dust. Like, why would you go looking at house dust? But a lot of these EDCs are what are known as semi-volatile organic compounds. They're semi-volatile. They're not always in air. They like to move around the indoor spaces. So they settle in dust. They settle on surfaces. They settle on us, on our skin. They settle on the different surfaces, things like windows or paints or things like that. And so they're moving around. And so it makes it, this is actually a schematic that came out of a recent NAS report, trying to understand kind of the complexity of some of the pollutants indoors and how they can move in the indoor spaces. This is important because it means that you could try to measure something in the indoor air and say, oh, it's not there. That's great. We're not exposed indoors. But that's because it's actually a fairly kind of heavy chemical, and it's actually in house dust, where unfortunately children are much more likely to be exposed to chemicals and dust. Think about little kids, right? They spend a lot of time on the floor. They drop their toy, they pick it up, they put their hands in their mouths. And so unfortunately, chemicals that like to reside in dust are a particular concern from exposures to children. And in fact, we did a study where we tried to look across many of those studies, this kind of meta-analysis where we tried to pull all the data together, looking at phthalates, things like parabens, flame retardants, fragrance chemicals, and fluorinated. These are the PFAS chemicals that I mentioned earlier, the stain-resistant, water-resistant chemicals. And we looked across many, many, many studies and found phthalates in 100% of the samples collected. I have collected hundreds of samples, and I always find phthalates in everybody's house. Flame retardants are very common. Things like parabens are very common. HHCV is actually a synthetic musk, a synthetic fragrance, and it is estrogenic. And it is found in all the samples that were looked at. This is just showing the concentrations. Mostly the point here, and these are all the abbreviations across the bottom here, but mostly what I want to point out here is that the concentrations of many of these chemicals span orders of magnitude. There's a lot of variability within a chemical and then across chemicals. And this is really important because you can look at variability actually as a way, if you understand the variability, what makes somebody a bit higher or lower, that actually can help you try to start understanding something about the sources of those chemicals in homes. So we often look at these chemicals in this way and very much observe with environmental chemicals that they span orders of magnitude. So this is actually some data that we collected on college campuses. And what I'm showing here is a principal component analysis. That's not as important as to show basically that many of these chemicals, things like PBDEs, which are flame retardant chemicals, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, PCBs, which you may have heard about, polychlorinated biphenyls, they were banned back in the 70s, pesticides, and again, those PFAS are coming back. They're found in a mixture indoors, in this case in dust. It's classroom dust. And we can kind of start teasing that mixture apart. And when we do that, we can actually find what we found is in this principal component. What this means, we found a significant relationship with the presence of wall-to-wall carpet. So what this means is that in spaces that had wall-to-wall carpet, we had significantly higher levels of PFAS. This makes sense when you think about that PFAS are extremely persistent chemicals, like decades persistent chemicals. And they're often added to things like carpets and other furnishings so they last longer, especially in these high use spaces like classrooms. they're not only in classrooms, but they're also found in our indoor spaces in our homes. There's actually air concentrations of, again, phthalates and these parabens found in homes, subsidized housing units in Boston, Cincinnati, and New Orleans. Again, the importance here is I'm trying to show the orders of magnitude in which even say like DEP, diethyl phthalate here, spans orders of magnitude. If we can start understanding why does this home have such high levels, that'll help us understand the sources. So we actually did what, trying to identify those sources and trying to say, okay, well, we have these we're measuring these really high levels. Can we start to disaggregate it into those chemicals that we believe are a result of the building itself, and then those chemicals that are a result of somebody moving into the space? We call, are they building related or are they occupant related? And so we did this study, it's called the move-in study. It's actually pretty hard to do, but it was in subsidized housing in Boston, and that was newly renovated. And we went in before the occupants, newly renovated, ready to go before the occupants moved in. And we set up our sampling equipment for a week. And then occupants moved in, we went back, had to recruit them into the study, kind of said, hey, we took samples back in your house, back in your housing unit a couple months ago, can we come back and take some more samples? And the importance here is that we compare those and we can say those chemicals that actually increased with occupancy, well, we'll call those occupant chemicals. Those are things that came in with the occupant. So any kind of interventions should focus on educating the occupant. Instead, those chemicals that were there or decreased over time, we'd say those are because of the building materials for the building itself. So there you would work with, say in this case, because it is subsidized housing, you'd work with things like agencies like HUD to talk about what building materials should be used. So this is a graph, these are some graphs that I'll go through some examples, but what I'm showing here are pre and post occupancy. So again, chemicals that are going up are related to occupancy. There are some chemicals, excuse me, we only detected with occupancy, things like flame retardants down here. There are some chemicals that went up significantly. These are synthetic fragrances. So that makes sense that the concentrations go up. This is triclosan. Triclosan is an antimicrobial, and it's used in a lot of personal care products. So it's not surprising those went up with occupancy. And BDE 47 is a flame retardant, again, went up with occupancy. All of these are targets for working with occupants around their behaviors and what products they're bringing into the home. In contrast, we can look at chemicals that are influenced by the building. So this is where we would start looking at building materials used in this space. Things like toluene and xylene, very well-known volatile organic compounds. We're at higher level. These are in many products that you can find in your local hardware store. They tend to go down over time, and so we'd say that they're related to the building. Benzophenone, this is a UV filter used in personal care products, but it's also used in paints. And so that's what's happening here. The levels are going down. And then these are two chemical flame retardants that are used in insulation. This one here on the right is a carcinogen. It's called chlorinated tris. We can also look at not only thinking about designing indoor studies to look at ways to identify sources, but this is actually a biomonitoring study that we conducted. It was actually a crowdsourced biomonitoring study, which means that people opted in. Instead of being recruited into the study, people opted in and said, I want to know what's in my body. And so they sent urine samples. In fact, 725 people sent us urine samples from across the country that we analyzed for many of these chemicals that we typically look for. And among these, we found that most people had 7 of the 10 that we tested in their body. So again, they're exposed to many or multiple consumer products at a time, consumer product chemicals at a time. We also found that the more products you use, so that's quartile paraben related product use, so more products along the x-axis, concentration along the y-axis. As you use more products, your concentrations go up. The key here, though, is that people who said that they try to read product labels to avoid parabens, they went up, but not as significantly, not as much. And in fact, that fourth quartile, they're significantly lower. This means that reading labels can help reduce exposures, which is really important if you're going to start designing interventions. For that same data, we actually also looked at pairs, people who lived in the same homes together, and tried to determine what are chemicals for which personal behaviors matter the most. What are chemicals for which there's some influence of the other person in your house, so the products that they might use, and then what's a result of what we call the shared household, is everything else, basically. And what's important here is things like parabens. Yes, it's totally what you're using, but there are some chemicals down here, or actually let's look at BP3. That's that UV filter that's used in personal care products, but it's also used in some other things. The importance here is that it matters what everybody else in your home is doing, not only what you're doing. And what this could mean is if you're doing an intervention study, you can actually have some sort of co-benefit to the other people in the houses. If you work to reduce your exposures, it could actually benefit others in your house, which is great news. Some other intervention work. So this is informing some other intervention work that we've done. This was actually what we call the couch swap study, where people opted to replace their furniture without added flame retardants in it. Basically their couch, actually, they're replaced. And we found significant reductions in many flame retardant chemicals with the swapping out of couches. And that's great. It's not the cheapest intervention or the easiest intervention necessarily, but it does mean that the next time you want to purchase a couch, which, most people keep their couches for 10, 15 years, you might want to ask for a couch that is flame retardant free. We're continuing this work to try to understand important sources. This is actually just a schematic of a study design of a study that we are currently conducting in Rochester, New York, that's looking at the influence of a national program that's funded by HUD that's called the Lead Hazard Control Program, which is meant to mitigate lead hazards in homes with children. And our hypothesis is that it may actually have added co-benefits by reducing exposure to other SVOCs, those are those semi-volatile organic compounds, things like phthalates and pesticides and flame retardant concentrations may also be decreasing. And so we're doing a study to try to look at that now. So what can you do? So I've told you these chemicals are in our bodies, they're in our homes. What can you do if you want to try to reduce your exposure? Well, I think of this as kind of, you can scale your action. There are things that consumers can do, you can personally do, right? There's things that you can engage institutions, retailers and manufacturers, or you can look at policies and regulations. So I want to share some of those tips or those solutions with you now. The first around consumer choices, then I'll talk about some institutions and retailers, and of course the regulations. So first, this is based on our research. What you can do is switching to a fresh food diet. This is a fresh food diet that does not include any food that comes from cans or that is stored or heated in plastics. Can significantly reduce your exposure to DHP, which is one of the most potent phthalates, which are well, they have a variety of health effects, including they're associated with asthma, but they are what most people think of as kind of phthalate syndrome, which is related to reproductive development in boys. So this in particular, you could say it would be very important for pregnant women, is to switch to a fresh food diet to reduce exposures to phthalates. You could also avoid canned food, because we have shown that consuming canned food or beverages increases your exposure to things like BPA. This is from our crowdsourced biomonitoring study. We've been doing this kind of research for 20 years around exposures, or more like 25 years now. And so about 5 years or so ago, we actually developed an app called Detox Me that compiles over 270 of our research-based tips to help you limit your exposure to many of these chemicals that I've talked about. And it is completely free. It's available on both iPhones and Android phones. It's available in English and Spanish, and you should kind of download it if you're interested. And you can see it kind of walks you through different kind of aspects. You know, is it home, personal care, cleaning, and etc. And that QR code will take you to a place where you can download it. I'll show that QR code in a second. Here are some of the things that you can learn in the Detox Me app. So again, these kind of top tips just distilled for you that you can find in the app. I've pulled out kind of my take-home tips is to look for paraben, phthalate, and fragrance-free products, eat more fresh foods instead of packaged foods, keep dust levels low in your house by using damp cloths, not with added cleaners, but just wetted cloths. Vacuum with a HEPA filter and open your windows. Steer clear of products that are advertised as stain resistant or antimicrobial to avoid both PFAS and then antimicrobials, things like triclosan. Make DIY cleaners. Keep it simple. It's also a lot cheaper to do that. So those are all things that you can do, and you'll find a lot of those in the app. We've also been engaging with institutions, things like the Cancer-Free Economy Network, which is a coalition of organizations working to try to prevent cancer across kind of in different approaches, mostly market-based. We can also engage with institutions around things like some of our work on college campuses come out of a program that we have. It's called the Healthy Green Campus. Actually, a recent study that actually came out last month, or actually now in December, is part of this Healthy Green Campus program. We installed these Corsi Rosenthal boxes, which you may have seen online as kind of DIY. You can get all the materials in your hardware store to develop these air filters that are actually very effective at mitigating COVID transmission, airborne transmission of COVID. And so we put them in, I work very closely with, this is a faculty member, Joe Braun at Brown School of Public Health. And we put them in classrooms all around Brown School of Public Health and found that they significantly reduce concentrations of PFAS and phthalates in indoor air in the classrooms, which is kind of a nice co-benefit of those DIY air filters. And some of our research too has moved to change markets and regulations. A lot of our flame retardant work, which I kind of touched on, but I could have a whole hour on that. But flame retardant chemicals, our demonstration that flame retardant chemicals varied by flammability standard, that they varied by housing conditions. They were higher in places that had more severe flammability standards. And then things like couch swapping, like you swapping out your couch, can significantly reduce your exposure to flame retardant chemicals. All of that was really instrumental in that you can now buy furniture, buy upholstered furniture without added flame retardants. And so this is what the label looks like that you want to look for. This is now the national standard, and you want to look for a label that says it contains no added flame retardant chemicals. So I want to invite you to check out our website. We have all of our scientific studies, peer-reviewed studies there. You can find all of that. You can also find access to our apps, a lot of our kind of tip sheets, learn a lot more about the institution by going to silentspring.org. You can scan this QR code, and I am very happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you so much. Why don't we, if you stop sharing, we will all be able to see everybody. There we go. and just unmute yourself and or raise your hand and feel free to ask Robin a question. And I guess I'll start. Do you work with the environmental working group?
Yeah, so we do.
Recommend
Yeah.
them as a good resource too?
Yeah, so the environmental working group, we definitely work for them. They are much more kind of consumer facing than we are. But if you look at many of their materials, you'll actually see many of our researchers on the research that they use to back up their tips and stuff. But yes, they have great resources. They have an app. They verify products. So they're a great resource.
And how could I get my body and my house involved in your research? Is it
Yeah, that's great. So up until the pandemic, we had that crowdsourced biomonitoring program open. We have yet to open it, but do have plans to reopen that biomonitoring program. That's the program where you can send in your urine sample. So it's not quite open yet. We are re-envisioning it, and we'll hope to launch it this year sometime. So check out our website.
Joel?
Let's see. Backing up to nutrients and foods, I'm a little confused about phytoestrogens. I hear that they're beneficial, sort of anti-estrogen at an early age, but on the other hand, they're discouraged in people who either have or have a propensity to estrogen dependent breast cancers. Can you elucidate a little bit?
Yeah, it's really tricky.
Especially all these people eating flax and soy now. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I think, I am not an expert on that, I will definitely say, but definitely the research I will say is it's looking like it kind of matters if you've always had a kind of a higher estrogen diet versus if you didn't. So if you are used to eating things with phytoestrogens like soys and things like that, you grew up eating those things, that's a different story than if you suddenly later in life start drinking soy milk and eating a lot of tofu. And so I think it matters kind of the consistency of it and it kind of actually what your body is used to. But it is true that many women who are undergoing breast cancer treatment are told to avoid phytoestrogens or things that might contain soy. And so it certainly matters kind of when you're exposed to them. But it's complicated, right? Because we do know that there are some cultures, like some Asian cultures, that have much more higher consumption of phytoestrogens and things like soy and tofu and things like that, and have lower breast cancer risk. So it's difficult to kind of pull apart.
Oh,
I wondered if you could make a comment about the difference between organic food in a grocery store and in non-organic food. That I'm thinking of berries and apples, things like that, whether you've looked at that at all.
Yeah, so we've definitely, and others have as well, looked at your exposure to pesticides based on your food habits. There was a very well-conducted study, it's 10 years old now or so, but that looked at children who were swapped out to an organic food diet, and they showed significant reductions. In fact, they kind of went to non-detects of pesticide levels in their bodies for children by switching to organic food diets. They've also shown that for people who do in other studies, and also these what are called temple stays, so where you might go and kind of move to really a vegetarian and organic diet, that you can actually very much kind of drop your levels of either both pesticides and phthalates because of switching your diet there. So yes, there is indication that you would certainly reduce your personal exposure to pesticides by moving to organic food. But I also want to point out the importance of that choosing organic can also avoid worker exposure to pesticides and things like that. Like there are much larger environmental issues around choosing pesticide-free foods.
the Environmental Working Group has a great list of the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. So apparently spending whatever it takes to buy organic strawberries and
Yes.
berries is very important. Organic tomatoes. I don't remember the other ones, but you don't have to worry about an avocado or a pineapple.
Right, the thick skin. I mean, think about like the thick skin of it. That's also like to grow strawberries just requires many more.
Oh, but apples are important to be organic.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
So, Robin, I have a question. Has in your looking at the literature, have you seen any relationship between exposure to endocrine disruptors and the proliferation of gender confusion that we seem to be seeing more and more of?
No, I have not. I haven't read any of those papers. So, no, it's a good question. I haven't really seen anything in the literature though.
Andy? You're muted.
What about chemicals in our water supply? We have pipes that are made of plastic that deliver water to our house.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? So there's the PVC exposure to PVC pipes. There's also, obviously Flint, Michigan had issues around lead pipes, and many places in the United States have issues around lead pipes. Unfortunately, it is an issue. There was a study that was conducted on Cape Cod that looked at PVC pipes and exposure to trichloroethylene, which is an organic chemical, chlorinated organic, and found higher levels because of the PVC. My understanding too, it depends on the age of it. It depends on a lot of things around kind of the hardness and the pH of the water. But that's actually not my area of expertise, but I know that there have been studies that have looked at that. And so that, and then obviously, of course, lead. And so trying to identify what is the best material to use is not a trivial thing, especially as they're ripping out a whole bunch of pipes and of lead pipes. And it's an important question, and I wish I had better answers, but I do know that there is research around that, and even local research.
Andy?
Bottled water, is that a better alternative?
Generally, we say no. Filtering your water at home is better. Bottled water I mean, we always joke, like Dasani is just Atlanta tap water. I mean, it's like, so it's as good as the local water quality system. So if you live in a place with a good water, with a good water department who is testing their water and you're able to filter your water, if there are any concerns, you're better off buying a good filter and drinking your tap water.
Thank you.
Andy? You had
I
a
was
question?
disappointed to learn that the non-stick cooking are all PFAS, and then I guess DuPont didn't like the bad publicity, so they changed it to PFOA. They just substituted a different chemical in there, which is probably just as bad. But and also the so-called the EPA, I guess, it used to be like parts per million, and now it's parts per trillion. And it's I guess it's like mercury. There's no good safe level that you can ingest. But
Yeah.
My question is on the detection and measurement side, because some of these are in small amounts. How good is our scientific equipment at doing that? I mean, can you just, it's not like Star Trek has a tricorder and they pick up all the chemicals in the room, but how does it require a lot of analysis, a lab to do that, or can you get a broad spectrum of, or do you have to search for particular chemicals?
Yeah, that is a great question. So many of the chemicals that I talked about today require us to collect a sample and then send it off to a chemistry lab where they analyze the sample for hundreds of dollars per sample. Like it's not cheap. It's not like I can walk around with a, a detector. So unfortunately, it's difficult. A lot of our analyses are done in what's called a targeted way, which means I say to the lab, look for this chemical, that chemical, and this chemical, right? More and more though, recently, there have been a lot of innovations in the chemistry area that where we're focusing on non-targeted, where you're basically looking across and trying to look for chemical signatures to identify new chemicals that we haven't kind of prioritized yet. And so that is actually a huge area right now in analytical chemistry, is kind of developing these non-targeted techniques and then working to identify things with confidence. Because you might say like, oh yeah, there's a lot in there, but then you have to look at the chemical structure, and then you try to identify it and name it, so that you can then try to understand how it's used, looking at other data sources. So yes, unfortunately, we are in a space where it's not super straightforward. I mean, if you wanted, to get your air sampled for these chemicals in particular, right, it would cost several $100s for one sample, which isn't great. But the methods are getting better and better. I will say PFAS are an interesting example where you mentioned that the levels keep dropping, the levels of concern keep dropping, right? And in fact, some of the levels that EPA came out with most recently, these are not enforceable standards yet. These are just levels that they are considering for some of their regulations, are actually far below what any lab could actually detect. And so it's really a call to the research community to say, all right, we think that the levels are really low that could cause an effect. Start innovating in the chemistry space to try to be able to, so we can actually detect things down at those low levels, parts per trillion levels that you mentioned.
And they're also known as forever chemicals because they stay in the body. You don't pass them out or anything. So
yeah, no. So unfortunately, right, we can do studies like the diet study that I showed, the fresh food diet study. In 3 days, you can significantly drop your exposure to things like phthalates. PFAS are totally different. It would take years to drop your PFAS levels because they'd stay in the body for a very long time. And that's really unfortunate. PFAS are also one of those, a chemical class that deserves a lot more attention, and it's getting attention, but in that we started thinking about PFAS and thought there were a couple hundred, and then people thought maybe there were like 2,000, and then the number about a year later went up to 4,000, and now the number is over 10,000 PFAS chemicals. And why that's important is because it's not just like, oh, it's a complex problem. It means that when we target a particular chemical, PFAS, like PFOA, and DuPont says, ooh, I'm gonna like start using different language. All they had to do was like swap out one fluorine, and they've got a brand new chemical that's like not on a radar yet. And so you have this like switching game that's happening that makes it really difficult. And so a lot of researchers, including at Silent Spring, were calling for regulations that think about things on a class-based as opposed to one chemical at a time. Because, right, going back to that, like if there are 300,000 chemicals in commerce, that's going to take a long time for us to regulate those chemicals, to demonstrate their safety, and then to possibly regulate them. But if we think about like chemicals, if we were to be able to clump all those PFAS together, there's 10,000 chemicals right there that are certainly showing some real concern from a health perspective. So we could go ahead and just regulate them as a class.
why can't the industry petition to use these chemicals and have them approved, as opposed to just throwing something out there and seeing what they can get away with?
Yeah, it's a really good point. You have to move to Europe because they do that in Europe.
Yeah.
They don't do that here. In fact, we are considered to be kind of a reactionary versus a precautionary approach to our chemical regulations in the United States, unfortunately.
Brian? You're muted, sir.
Okay, thank you. In the Pacific Northwest, you know the story about the right whale, or sorry, the killer whales. It's kind of heartbreaking, but a lot of the older males used to die because they would build up chemicals in their fat and there would be no way to get rid of them. The mothers actually would live, but their first calves would die. And what would happen is that when the first calf started to nurse, the mother would metabolize her fats and the pollution would come out, kill the firstborn. I'm kind of, does something, maybe not quite so horrific happen to humans? Could that happen?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes, for some of these chemicals that are like lipophilic, who like to hang out with fats. A lot of these like chlorinated chemicals, PCBs, things like that, they can pass through milk, through lactation. And in fact, that's how some very young children are first exposed. And so if you actually look at some of the biomonitoring data, you can actually see a blip of like toddlers having higher levels and lactating mothers having slightly lower levels than others, other adults, because of that ability to transfer contamination. However, the research out there suggests that it is not a reason to not breastfeed. In fact, that the benefits of breastfeeding, the other benefits far outweigh some of those concerns about sharing contamination with your newborn.
It's so discouraging. Would having indoor house plants be helpful?
That's a good question. I was just looking at that because we were contemplating whether or not we should add that as a tip in our app to Detox Me, because we get that question a lot. And I, like, just before this, I was reading some papers. The suggestion is that in well-conducted kind of chamber studies, they show a significant reduction, the improvement in indoor air quality, except that somebody then, of very smart folks about 2 years ago, did a study where they actually did a calculation, these engineers, where they determined that you would need between 10 and 100 plants per square meter to actually work. So, unfortunately, I don't think they're the best air cleaners. I think that it's too bad. Although there are, and this is not my area of expertise, but right, I know that there are studies that are about mental, kind of it reduces stress and all that. There's other benefits of having plants, but unfortunately, they cannot act as effective air cleaners in homes.
Another potential problem with indoor plants is they require watering, and watering can be too much or too little, which then can promote mold growth, which would further degrade the indoor quality. So it's complicated, as they say.
Yeah.
In one of your charts, I think I saw PAHs, which I believe are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, when you burn food. So here's but I didn't see any further mention of that, about caution when you clean your electric oven or you eat burned food, what the consequences might be there.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. PAHs have actually been linked to increased breast cancer risk. It's something because they're not found in consumer products. My research doesn't focus on them a lot, but we certainly, we have some tips in our app about kind of, marinating food instead of charring food for taste and things like that, to actually ventilate while you're cooking, to try to reduce your exposure to char and to smoke, which can contain PAHs.
Caramelized onions.
And gas stoves.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a lot. I mean, the asthma implications with gas stoves are pretty remarkable. So
Has there been any research done about multiple chemical sensitivity and the exposure to these chemicals?
yes, there has. It's not my area necessarily, but I know that there have been several researchers very active in looking at endocrine disrupting chemicals and multiple chemical sensitivity. There's actually a kind of a well-established person in university. I think she's at UT. I don't know if it's Austin. In Texas, that is focused specifically on those concerns around multiple chemical sensitivity.
Do we have any other questions? All right, I guess that's a wrap, as they say. Thank you, Robin, for all the good information, all the good work.
Great. You're very welcome, and I encourage you to check out our website, reach out if you have questions, and thank you for the opportunity.
So your email is dodson@silencespring.org.
Exactly. Yep.
And we'll have this on our the video recording up in a couple of days on our YouTube channel.
Great.
So,
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yes, thank you.